The moon cast long shadows across Diego Garcia's eastern shoreline as I continued my patrol. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the cooler night air. 3 hours into my shift, and the monotony had settled in like an old friend. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore provided a constant backdrop to my footsteps as I walked the perimeter fence line, my boots leaving clear impressions in the damp soil. Diego Garcia wasn't exactly where I'd imagined spending my military career. A tiny horseshoe-shaped atoll in the middle of the Indian Ocean, it was technically British territory, though our American presence dominated the Joint Operation Base. Most nights, the island felt impossibly remote, cut off from the rest of the world. I checked my watch, 1:47 a.m. The graveyard shift was both blessing and curse. The tropical heat eased after sunset, but the isolation grew more pronounced. I'd been assigned this route for 3 weeks now, and each night blended into the next in an endless loop of sameness. My flashlight beam caught the glint of barbed wire topping the fence as I scanned the beach beyond our perimeter. The narrow strip of sand curved gently before disappearing into the dark water on one side and dense jungle on the other. Nothing moved except the occasional crab scuttling across the sand. I took a moment to look up at the night sky. With no light pollution, the stars were brilliant here, scattered across the darkness like spilled salt. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a cloudy river of light. It was easy to forget the tedium when faced with a view like this. My radio crackled, breaking the peaceful moment. "Martinez, you still awake out there?" James's voice had that slight edge of amusement he always used with the night patrol. "Roger that," I replied, pressing the talk button. "Just enjoying the 5-star accommodations on the east fence." I heard his short laugh through the static. "I'm heading your way. Stay put." 15 minutes later, I spotted his approaching flashlight beam bouncing through the darkness. James materialized from the shadows, his blonde hair looking almost white in the moonlight. He stood slightly taller than me, with the solid build of someone who took PT seriously. "How's it going, Martinez?" he asked, switching off his flashlight to preserve his night vision. "Quiet as always, nothing to report." James nodded, scanning the perimeter beyond me. "Keep your eyes open tonight. We've had reports of possible activity in this area." "What kind of activity?" "Could be locals, some Chagosians trying to fish in restricted waters. Could be wild boars from the jungle. Security cameras caught movement, but nothing clear." He adjusted his weapon strap. "Command just wants us to stay alert." I nodded. The relationship with the remaining Chagosian natives was complicated at best. Most had been forcibly removed when the military base was established decades ago, but a small population remained to work various support roles around the base. "Will do," I said. "I'll check back before your shift ends," James said, turning to leave. "Radio if you see anything unusual." I watched his light bobbing away until it disappeared around a bend in the fence line. Then I was alone again with the waves and the stars. I continued my patrol, more alert now after James's warning. The minutes ticked by slowly. My thoughts drifted to home, to my mother's birthday coming up next week. I needed to find time to call her. At 2:18 a.m. I saw it. A dark figure moving along the beach, parallel to the fence line about 50 yards out. I froze, narrowing my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing things. The figure was human-shaped but moved with unnatural speed. I'd seen Olympic sprinters on TV. This was different. This person covered ground that would take me a full minute in mere seconds, practically flying across the sand. The movement wasn't just fast. It was wrong somehow, too fluid, too efficient for human locomotion. I grabbed my radio. "James, this is Martinez. I've got visual on someone on the East Beach moving north at high speed, requesting permission to investigate." His response came quickly. "Description?" "Single individual moving faster than..." I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "Moving very fast along the shoreline. Can't make out details at this distance." There was a brief pause. "Roger that." Permission granted to investigate. Maintain radio contact. I didn't waste time. I secured my weapon, found the nearest access point in the fence, and climbed over, dropping down onto the other side. My boots sank slightly into the sand as I broke into a run toward where I'd last seen the figure. The beach stretched empty before me now. Had I lost them already? I pushed harder, my breathing growing heavier as I sprinted across the uneven surface. The sand made running difficult, but years of military training had prepared me for worse conditions. A movement caught my eye, a shadow against shadows near the water's edge, still moving north. I changed course to intercept, pushing my muscles to their limit. The salt air burned my lungs as I gulped for breath. Despite my best efforts, the gap between us widened. Whoever this was, they moved with impossible speed, almost gliding across the terrain. I'd been a cross-country runner in high school and kept myself in peak condition. But this wasn't normal human capability. Just as I realized I couldn't possibly catch up, the figure made a sudden turn. I slowed, watching in disbelief as they changed direction without losing any momentum, heading straight toward the ocean. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice seeming small against the crash of waves. The figure didn't hesitate. With the same unnatural speed, they plunged directly into the crashing surf. I ran to the water's edge, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, searching the waves. Nothing. No swimming figure, no head bobbing among the whitecaps. Just the endless rhythm of waves breaking against the shore. I stood there, chest heaving, sweat cooling on my skin despite the tropical night. The ocean stretched dark and empty before me, waves rolling in as if nothing unusual had happened. I swept my light back and forth across the water's surface, searching for any sign of the person I'd been chasing. "James." The subject entered the water, I said into my radio, still catching my breath. No visual. They just disappeared into the ocean. As I waited for his response, I stared out at the dark water. What had I just seen? No human could move that fast. And who would dive into these rough waters in the middle of the night? I stood alone on the empty beach, the waves erasing all evidence of the figure's footprints, leaving me with nothing but questions and the certainty that something wasn't right on this island. I lingered on the beach for a few more minutes, scanning the dark waves for any sign of the figure. Nothing. Just water crashing against sand, as if mocking my confusion. With a last look at the spot where the person had vanished, I turned and trudged back toward the fence line. The fence loomed ahead, its metal links gleaming dully in the moonlight. I climbed back over at the access point, my boots hitting the packed dirt on the other side with a soft thud. My radio crackled again. "Martinez, report. Did you find anything?" James's voice sounded tense. "Negative on apprehension," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the uneasiness crawling up my spine. Subject entered the water and disappeared. "Roger that. Meet me at the east gate in 15. I walked along the perimeter, my flashlight beam bobbing ahead of me on the path. The island felt different now, the familiar terrain suddenly strange and unwelcoming. The dense jungle beyond the fence seemed to watch me, the darkness between the trees deeper than before. James was waiting when I arrived at the gate, his face partly hidden in shadow. He straightened up when he saw me. "So, what happened out there?" he asked as I approached. I took a deep breath. I saw someone moving along the beach. They were running parallel to the fence line, heading north. Local? Couldn't tell. Too dark, and they were moving. I hesitated, knowing how it would sound. They were moving faster than any person should be able to move. James's expression hardened. "What do you mean by that?" "I mean they were covering ground like nothing I've ever seen. I'm a good runner, you know that, but this person..." I shook my head. "They moved like they weren't bound by normal physics. And then they just turned and went straight into the ocean. Into the waves, just like that?" "Just like that. No hesitation. 1 second they were on the beach, the next they were in the water. And then, gone. James rubbed his jaw, his skepticism plain on his face. You sure you weren't seeing things? It's dark out there. And after a few hours on patrol, I know what I saw. I cut in, my voice sharper than intended. This wasn't a trick of the light or fatigue. This was real. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right. Write it up in your report. Full details. You don't believe me. I didn't say that, James replied, his voice softening slightly. But extraordinary claims need solid evidence. Right now, all we have is your word. I didn't respond. What could I say? I hardly believed it myself. Yet I knew what I'd seen. Finish your patrol, James said, checking his watch. We'll talk more tomorrow. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but sleep didn't come easily when I finally made it back to my bunk. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure gliding across the sand, moving with impossible speed before vanishing into the dark water. Morning came too soon. The mess hall buzzed with the usual breakfast chatter as I filled my tray with powdered eggs and toast. My eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep, and my mind still churned with questions about the previous night. I spotted Carlos sitting alone at a corner table and made my way over. He looked up from his coffee as I set my tray down. You look like hell, he said by way of greeting. Thanks. I slumped into the chair across from him. Rough night. Carlos leaned forward, lowering his voice. I heard you had some excitement on patrol. Chased someone on the beach? News traveled fast on a small base like this. Yeah, something like that. James mentioned you thought they were moving unusually fast. I pushed my eggs around with my fork. I don't just think it. They were. Carlos nodded, his expression unexpectedly serious. You're not the only one who's noticed weird stuff lately. That got my attention. What do you mean? The locals have been acting strange, he said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. The Chagosians. They've been gathering in groups at night, talking among themselves, more secretive than usual. How do you know this? Carlos shrugged. I talk to people. The cook's assistant is half Chagosian, says his cousins have been avoiding the base personnel, won't tell him what's going on. And Singh from maintenance? He saw a group of them on the North Shore 2 nights ago, standing in a circle on the beach. Just standing there, not fishing, not doing anything. Just watching the water. A chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the mess hall's aggressive air conditioning. You think this connects to what I saw? Don't know, but there's something else. Carlos leaned even closer. There's this cave system on the northern part of the island. Not on any of the official maps, but the locals know about it. And according to what I've heard, they've been going there a lot lately. A cave? I asked. What for? No idea. But whatever's happening, that's where it's centered. The scrape of a chair interrupted us as James set his tray down at our table. Morning, he said, eyeing us both. You two look serious. Carlos sat back, taking a sip of his coffee. Just telling Martinez about the Chagosians. What about them? James asked. Carlos repeated what he'd told me about the natives' strange behavior and the cave on the North Shore. James listened intently, his initial skepticism giving way to something more thoughtful. And you think this might be connected to what Martinez saw last night? He asked when Carlos finished. It's possible, I said. Something's not right on this island. James considered this for a moment, then lowered his voice. If there's a security concern, we should check it out. This cave, you know where it is? Carlos nodded. I can find it. It's supposed to be partly hidden behind some vegetation and coral formations, but once you know what to look for, it's not hard to spot. We should go tonight, I suggested, surprising myself with my eagerness. After our shifts, see if we can figure out what's happening. James gave me a long look. You're really bothered by what you saw, aren't you? Wouldn't you be? Someone moving like that isn't normal. And now we hear the locals are acting strange, meeting in secret. I shook my head. We need answers. After a moment, James nodded. All right. Tonight, after final duty rotation, we'll meet at the north perimeter fence at 2100 hours. Bring flashlights and basic gear. We doing this officially? Carlos asked. James shook his head. Off the record for now, until we know what we're dealing with. The rest of the day dragged by, my mind constantly returning to the figure on the beach and what we might find in the cave. Something was happening on Diego Garcia, something beyond the ordinary security concerns of a remote military base. And tonight, maybe we'd start to uncover what it was. As I went through the motions of my assigned duties, I couldn't shake the feeling that the island was holding its breath, waiting for something. The bright tropical sun beat down as usual, palm trees swayed in the breeze, and military personnel went about their business, but beneath the surface of normalcy, something had shifted. Like the first tremors before an earthquake, barely perceptible but hinting at the destruction to come. Tonight we would search for answers. I just hoped we were ready for what we might find. The sun had already set by the time I finished my shift. I headed straight to my quarters, traded my uniform for dark pants and a black t-shirt, and grabbed my backpack. Inside, I'd packed a flashlight, extra batteries, water, a small first aid kit, and my personal knife. Basic gear, like James had said. Nothing that would raise questions if someone spotted us. I checked my watch. 20:45. 15 minutes to reach the north perimeter fence where we'd agreed to meet. I left my quarters, keeping my pace casual as I passed other soldiers heading to the rec center or mess hall. No one paid me much attention. On a small base like this, people respected what little privacy could be found. James and Carlos were already waiting when I arrived at the rendezvous point. James wore dark clothes similar to mine, with a utility belt holding various gear. Carlos had a small backpack slung over one shoulder and was checking something on his phone. "You're early," I said, approaching them. James nodded. "Better early than late. Carlos says the cave is about 2 miles up the coast." "Yeah." Carlos tucked his phone away. "It'll take us maybe 40 minutes to get there, depending on the terrain." We slipped through the perimeter fence, using a maintenance access point that Carlos knew about. The night air felt heavy with humidity, and insects buzzed around us as we made our way north along the coastline. The three of us moved silently for the most part, each lost in our own thoughts about what we might find. The moon provided enough light to navigate by, casting silver reflections on the water to our right. To our left, the dense jungle vegetation created a wall of darkness. The sand made walking difficult in places, and my boots sank deeper with each step. "So what exactly did your contact tell you about this cave?" I asked Carlos after we'd been walking for about 20 minutes. "Not much," he admitted. "Just that it's been there as long as anyone can remember. The locals consider it sacred in some way. Usually they leave offerings there, small things like flowers or food. But lately they've been going more often and in larger groups." "And nobody from the base ever checks it out?" James asked. "It's not on any official maps," Carlos replied. "And technically we're supposed to respect the natives' religious sites, part of the agreement that lets us operate here." We continued walking, the only sounds our footsteps on the sand and the constant rhythm of waves. About 10 minutes later, Carlos slowed down and pointed ahead. "Should be right around here," he said, moving closer to where the beach met a rocky outcropping. Behind those rocks and vegetation, we approached cautiously. At first glance, the cliff face looked solid, covered in thick vegetation and coral formations that had formed on the limestone over centuries. But as we got closer, I noticed a dark gap partially hidden behind a cluster of plants. James pulled back some of the vegetation, revealing an opening about 4 feet high. "This it?" Carlos nodded. Must be. We switched on our flashlights. The beam from mine cut through the darkness, illuminating a narrow passage that extended beyond the reach of my light. "I'll go first," I said, ducking to enter the cave. The others followed close behind. The passage widened after about 15 feet, allowing us to stand upright. The cave walls were rough limestone, with occasional patches of some kind of moss or fungus growing in the damper sections. Our flashlight beams bounced off the walls, creating strange moving shadows that played tricks on my eyes. "The air feels different in here," I noted, as we moved deeper into the cave system. It was thick and humid, but there was something else. A strange metallic smell that I couldn't place. It reminded me of blood, but mixed with something else, something I'd never encountered before. Carlos pointed his flashlight at the ground. "Look at this." Fresh footprints marked the sandy cave floor, dozens of them going in both directions. Some looked to be from bare feet, others from simple sandals. "These are recent," James said, crouching to examine them. "Could be from today or yesterday at most." We continued forward, following the main passage as it sloped gradually downward. The temperature seemed to rise the deeper we went, and that strange smell grew stronger. The silence was broken only by the sound of water dripping somewhere in the distance and our own cautious footsteps. The passage opened into a larger chamber with a ceiling high enough that our flashlights couldn't reach it. The room branched off in 3 directions. James gestured for us to stick together as we moved toward the largest of the new passages. "Wait," Carlos said suddenly. "Look at the walls." I directed my flashlight where he pointed. Carved into the limestone were symbols I'd never seen before. Strange, angular shapes and spirals that didn't resemble any language I recognized. They seemed to tell a story, moving across the wall in sequences. "What is that?" I asked, moving closer to examine the carvings. "Some kind of local writing?" "I don't think so," James replied, his voice tense. "The Chagassians use English or Creole. This is something else." As we moved deeper into the next chamber, my flashlight beam caught something that made me freeze. In the center of the room stood what could only be described as an altar, a crude structure made from driftwood and pieces of coral, assembled with care. Dark stains covered its surface and the cave floor around it. "Is that blood?" Carlos whispered. James moved closer, examining the stains without touching them. "Looks like it. Old and new." My flashlight beam moved beyond the altar, and what I saw next made my stomach turn. Partially hidden in a recess in the wall were remains, animal at first glance, arranged in a circular pattern. The corpses of several fish, crabs, and what looked like a seabird had been positioned deliberately. "This is messed up," Carlos said, his voice barely audible. We continued through another narrow passage, the walls now covered with more of those strange symbols. The air grew increasingly thick, that metallic smell now overwhelming. The passage opened into an even larger chamber, and my flashlight beam swept across a scene that would haunt me for years to come. Bodies, human bodies. At least 3 of them, positioned in a triangular formation around another, larger altar. They were in various states of decay, but all showed signs of deliberate mutilation. Limbs had been removed and positioned separately from the torsos. Deep cuts formed patterns across what remained of the skin. "Jesus Christ," James breathed, his usually composed demeanor cracking. I moved my flashlight across the grotesque scene, forcing myself to look at the faces. With a sick feeling in my gut, I recognized one of them. A middle-aged Chagossian man who worked in the base's maintenance department. He'd been reported missing 2 weeks ago. "That's Ravi," I said, pointing. "He disappeared while fishing, according to the report." "And that one," Carlos added, his voice shaking slightly as he pointed to another body. "That's gotta be Madhu. She worked in the laundry facilities. Went missing about 3 weeks ago." James took a step back, his face hard with controlled shock. "This isn't random. This is..." He gestured at the deliberate positioning of the bodies and limbs. "This is ritual. Sacrifice." Carlos pulled out his phone and began taking pictures, the flash illuminating the horrible scene in bursts of light. The walls of this chamber were covered completely with the strange symbols, more elaborate here than in the outer chambers. Some had been recently carved, the limestone dust still visible on the floor below. "Look at this," James said, pointing to a section of wall covered with a sequence of symbols. "These look like dates or times, and these," he pointed to another section, "these repeated patterns might be names." He took out a small notebook and began copying some of the symbols, working quickly. I forced myself to examine the rest of the chamber, playing my flashlight over every corner. There were more remains, parts of animals mixed with human limbs, all arranged in specific patterns that clearly held meaning to whoever had created this horror. "We need to report this," I said, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "This is multiple homicide. Murder." "Wait," Carlos said, moving his flashlight beam to the far corner of the chamber. "There's something else there." We approached cautiously. In the corner lay a pile of clothing, military clothing. Pieces of a uniform torn to shreds, covered in dried blood. No body, just the clothing. "That's a base uniform," James said, crouching to examine the fabric without touching it. "American, not British." A chill ran through me. "Someone from our unit? Can't tell. Too much blood, and no identification left." Carlos continued taking photos while James collected samples of the strange substance that coded some of the symbols. I stood watch, my senses on high alert for any sound of approach. The knowledge that whoever did this could return at any time made every drip of water, every shift of air, seem threatening. "We should go," I said after a few minutes. "We've seen enough. We need to get this information back to base." James nodded, pocketing his samples. "Agreed. Carlos, you got everything?" "Yeah," Carlos replied, checking his phone. "Dozens of photos, clear shots of everything." We made our way back through the chambers, moving more quickly now. The horrific images stayed with me, playing behind my eyes with each blink. Who could do something like that? And why? The deliberate nature of it all suggested purpose, ritual, not the random violence of a disturbed individual. As we neared the cave entrance, James held up a hand to stop us. "Listen." We froze, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but the distant drip of water. Then faintly came the sound of voices, multiple people speaking in low tones, approaching the cave from outside. James gestured toward a small side passage we'd passed earlier. We ducked into it, switching off our flashlights. The darkness was absolute, pressing against my eyes like a physical weight. The voices grew louder, accompanied by the soft glow of torchlight at the cave entrance. I counted at least 4 distinct voices, speaking what sounded like a mixture of English and Creole. They moved past our hiding place, heading deeper into the cave system, their torchlight casting long shadows across the walls. We waited until the light and voices had faded completely before moving again. James led the way to the entrance, checking outside before signaling us to follow. We emerged into the night air, which felt clean and sweet after the thick, tainted atmosphere of the cave. Without speaking, we moved quickly along the beach, putting distance between ourselves and the cave entrance. Only when we were at least half a mile away did James slow our pace. "That was close," Carlos said, his voice still hushed despite the distance. "Too close," James agreed, "but we got what we came for. Evidence." I nodded, my mind still processing what we'd seen. Those people we just heard, they were going to the ritual chamber. Tonight. "All the more reason to report this immediately," James said. "First thing tomorrow morning, we take this to Colonel Anderson. This goes way beyond some local unrest or cultural practice. This is murder." The walk back to base seemed longer, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. The images from the cave played on repeat in my mind. The symbols, the altars, the deliberate arrangements of body parts. What kind of belief system demanded such brutal sacrifice? And how had this been happening right under our noses? When we reached the perimeter fence, James turned to face us. Not a word of this to anyone else tonight. We go straight to Anderson in the morning with everything we found. Carlos, back up those photos somewhere secure. Carlos nodded. Already done. Sent them to my personal email as soon as we got back in cell range. Good. Get some rest if you can. Or 800 hours tomorrow, we meet outside the command center. We parted ways, each heading to our respective quarters. Back in my room, I stripped off my clothes and stood under the shower for a long time, as if the water could somehow wash away the memory of what I'd seen. But the images remained, seared into my mind with perfect clarity. The symbols, the bodies, the blood. Whatever was happening on this island went far deeper than strange sightings or unusual behavior. Something terrible was taking place in the shadows, something that had already claimed multiple lives, and tomorrow we would bring it into the light. Sleep proved impossible after what we'd seen in the cave. I lay in my bunk, staring at the ceiling, images of the mutilated bodies flashing behind my eyes every time I closed them. By the time my alarm went off at 0600, I'd already been up for an hour, showered, and changed into my uniform. James and Carlos were waiting outside the mess hall when I arrived. None of us looked like we'd slept much. Dark circles shadowed Carlos's usually bright eyes, and James's face had a tight, drawn quality I rarely saw. "You ready for this?" James asked as I approached. I nodded. "Anderson needs to know what's happening on this island." We skipped breakfast, none of us having much appetite. Instead, we headed straight to the command center, walking in silence across the base as it stirred to life around us. The morning sun beat down already, promising another scorching day, but the heat barely registered. "Remember," James said as we neared the command building, "let me do most of the talking initially. Anderson respects chain of command." At precisely 800, we presented ourselves at Colonel Anderson's office. His secretary, a British lance corporal with a perpetually bored expression, announced our arrival through the intercom. A moment later, we were ushered inside. Colonel Anderson sat behind his desk, reviewing documents. He didn't look up when we entered, taking his time to finish whatever he was reading before acknowledging our presence. The office was impeccably neat, not a paper out of place, every item positioned with military precision. "Staff Sergeant James," Anderson finally said, setting his papers aside. "I understand you have something urgent to report." "Yes, sir." James stepped forward. "Last night we discovered evidence of multiple homicides on the island." That got Anderson's attention. He leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze sharpening. "Explain." James outlined our discovery of the cave and what we'd found inside, the strange symbols, the ritualistic arrangements, and finally, the mutilated bodies. As he spoke, Carlos pulled out his phone and brought up the photos. "With your permission, sir," Carlos said. "I documented everything we found." Anderson held out his hand for the phone. He scrolled through the images slowly, methodically, his expression never changing. I watched his face carefully, looking for some reaction to the grotesque images. Shock, disgust, horror. But his features remained completely neutral, as if he were reviewing supply requisition forms rather than photos of dismembered human beings. "And you identified some of these remains?" Anderson asked, his voice flat. "Yes, sir," I replied. "We recognized Ravi from maintenance and Madhu from laundry services. Both were reported missing in the past month." "We also found torn American military uniform pieces, sir," James added, "covered in blood, but no body." Anderson continued scrolling through the photos, pausing occasionally on images of the strange symbols. "And these markings? Any idea what they represent?" "No, sir," James said. "They don't match any known local language or script. But they were carved with purpose, arranged in specific patterns throughout the cave. Anderson handed the phone back to Carlos. You three entered a restricted area without authorization. The statement hung in the air, not a question, an accusation. Sir, I said, unable to stay silent. With respect, we found evidence of multiple murders. These people were ritually killed and arranged as part of some kind of ceremony. Anderson's cold eyes shifted to me. Did you have permission to leave the base perimeter, Martinez? No, sir, but did you follow proper protocols for investigating suspicious activity? Sir, James interjected. We felt immediate action was necessary based on intelligence we'd gathered about unusual activity among the native population. Anderson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You should have reported your concerns through proper channels instead of conducting your own unauthorized investigation. Sir, Carlos said, these killings appear to be ongoing. We heard people entering the cave as we were leaving. There could be more victims if we don't act quickly. Anderson was silent for a long moment, studying each of us in turn. I'll need to consult with British authorities about this matter. In the meantime, return to your regular duties. Speak of this to no one. Dismissed. We hesitated, exchanging glances. Sir, I said, shouldn't we secure the cave site? Preserve the evidence? That will be handled through appropriate channels, Martinez. Anderson's tone left no room for argument. You're dismissed. We had no choice but to leave. Outside the command center, we paused to regroup. That went differently than I expected, Carlos said quietly. James frowned. He didn't seem surprised. Or concerned, I added. Did you see his face? Nothing. Not even when he was looking at those bodies. Maybe he's just good at hiding his reactions, Carlos suggested. Military command and all that. I shook my head. Something's not right. Let's give him time to contact the British authorities, James said. It's a complicated situation with the jurisdictional issues on this island. We separated to attend our assigned duties, agreeing to meet at lunch to discuss next steps. The morning dragged by as I mechanically went through equipment inspections, my mind still in that cave with its horrible contents. By noon, I was on edge, watching the clock and waiting for some announcement, some sign that action was being taken. But lunch came and went with no word from Anderson or anyone else in command. James, Carlos, and I sat at a corner table, speaking in hushed tones. Nothing from the British side either, James reported. I checked with Corporal Reed at Joint Operations. No unusual activity, no emergency meetings. They can't just ignore this, I insisted. There are bodies in that cave. Murdered people. Before either could respond, our radios crackled simultaneously. Staff Sergeant James, Specialist Martinez, Corporal Mendez, report to Colonel Anderson's office immediately. We exchanged looks and left our half-eaten meals behind. Anderson was standing when we entered his office, hands clasped behind his back. His posture was rigid, his expression hard. Close the door, he ordered. Carlos shut it behind us. I've reviewed this matter thoroughly, Anderson began without preamble. The situation falls entirely under British jurisdiction due to our status agreement on Diego Garcia. As such, American military personnel are explicitly prohibited from interfering. Sir? James asked, confusion evident in his voice. You are to delete all photographs taken in the cave, Anderson continued. You are to destroy any notes or samples collected. And you are to forget what you saw there. Silence fell over the room. I felt a chill despite the office's warmth. Sir, I said carefully, we have evidence of multiple homicides. Evidence that was gathered illegally, without authorization, in violation of base protocols and international agreements. Anderson's voice remained even, controlled. The British authorities have been notified. They will handle the investigation according to their procedures. And if they don't, I pressed. Anderson's eyes narrowed slightly. That is not your concern, Specialist. Your concern is following orders. Colonel, James said, stepping forward slightly. With respect, this appears to be an ongoing situation. Those bodies were in different states of decay, suggesting the killings have been happening over time, and we heard people entering the cave last night. If we don't act, you will not act. Anderson cut him off sharply. You will delete those photos now, Corporal Mendez. Carlos looked uncomfortable. Sir, I've already backed them up to my email. Delete them from your phone and your email, now. Carlos reluctantly pulled out his phone and began the process. This isn't right, I said, unable to contain myself. People are being killed. Our own personnel could be at risk. Anderson stepped closer to me, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Let me be absolutely clear, Specialist Martinez. This matter is closed. If you pursue it further, if you discuss it with anyone, if you so much as mention that cave again, I will have you court-martialed for insubordination and violation of direct orders. Is that understood? I wanted to argue, to push back, but James gave me a warning look. Yes, sir, I finally said, the words tasting bitter. The same goes for all of you, Anderson continued, looking at James and Carlos. This incident never happened. You were never in that cave. You saw nothing. Am I clear? Yes, sir, they responded in unison. Good. Dismissed. We filed out of his office, none of us speaking until we were well away from the command center. He's covering it up, I said once we were clear. Why would he do that? James looked troubled. I don't know, but he's serious about the threats. So we just let it go? I asked incredulously. Pretend we didn't see those bodies? I didn't say that, James replied carefully. But we need to be smart about this. Getting ourselves court-martialed won't help anyone. Carlos checked his phone. I deleted the photos from my device, but he hesitated, looking around to make sure no one was within earshot. I sent copies to my brother back home before our meeting this morning, just in case. I felt a small surge of relief. Smart thinking. Look, James said, for now we follow orders. We keep our heads down, but we stay alert. Watch for patterns, gather information carefully. And then what? I asked. James had no answer for that. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine tasks that felt meaningless after what we'd discovered. How could I focus on inventory reports and equipment maintenance when there were mutilated bodies in a cave just miles away, when whoever was responsible was still out there, possibly planning their next ritual? By late afternoon, I needed some air. I finished my duties and walked toward the eastern perimeter, hoping the ocean breeze might clear my head. As I neared the fence line, I noticed something unusual. There were more Chagosians visible than normal. The locals typically kept to themselves, fishing or working in the few approved areas where they were permitted on the military-controlled portion of the island. But today, small groups of them stood at various points along the perimeter, watching the base. Their posture seemed tense, agitated. I slowed my pace, observing them without being obvious. One group of 4 men stood near a maintenance access point, talking among themselves in low voices. Another trio of older Chagosians had positioned themselves on a small rise overlooking the motor pool. None were engaged in their usual activities, just watching, waiting. Near the beach, I spotted a larger gathering, perhaps 15 people, including some I recognized from the base's civilian workforce. They formed a loose circle, heads bent together in what appeared to be intense discussion. When one of our patrols approached, they dispersed quickly, moving in different directions with practiced efficiency. Something was happening. The tension that had been building was reaching some kind of breaking point. I thought about the cave, the rituals, the symbols carved into the walls. Was this connected? Were they preparing for something? I turned to head back to the barracks, planning to find James and Carlos to share my observations, when something else caught my attention. To the southwest, dark clouds had begun to form on the horizon, heavy, ominous masses that signaled an approaching storm. The weather had been clear that morning, with no forecast for significant precipitation. I stopped to watch the clouds building. They seemed to roll and churn with unusual speed, spreading across the previously blue sky like spilled ink. A strange feeling settled in my gut. The same uneasiness I'd felt watching that impossible figure race across the beach and dive into the ocean. The island felt different now, charged with an energy I couldn't explain. Between Anderson's cover-up, the agitated locals, and this sudden storm, something was building. Something beyond normal explanation. And somehow I knew we were running out of time to stop it. I was still watching the strange formation of clouds when my radio crackled. "Martinez, report to Lieutenant Wright at the communications tower. You're on monitoring duty tonight." "Copy that," I replied, taking one last look at the southwestern horizon where the storm was building. The clouds had grown even darker in just the few minutes I'd been standing there, rolling and churning with unusual speed. The air felt heavy, charged with an electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. Whatever was coming wasn't an ordinary storm. I turned and jogged back toward the center of the base. The communications tower stood near the command building, rising above the surrounding structures. It was rarely fully staffed except during operations or emergencies, but with a storm approaching, someone needed to monitor conditions and maintain contact with other bases in the region. Lieutenant Wright was waiting when I arrived, looking harried as he checked weather reports on one of the main screens. "Martinez, good. You're on weather monitoring and radio communications tonight. Track the storm's progress, log all communications, and report any significant developments to command." He handed me a clipboard with the standard monitoring protocols. "This one's moving in fast. Forecasts didn't show anything this size 12 hours ago." "Yes, sir," I said, glancing at the radar display showing the massive storm system bearing down on the island. "Any evacuation orders?" "Not yet. Anderson wants to wait and see if it changes course." Wright checked his watch. "I need to help secure the aircraft. You know the drill. Hourly reports unless something changes dramatically." After Wright left, I settled into the monitoring station. The communications tower offered a panoramic view of the island through its windows. To the east, I could see the beach where I'd patrolled just days ago and encountered the impossible figure. To the south and west, the storm approached, dark clouds now dominating half the sky. I ran through the standard checks, establishing contact with regional command in Bahrain and confirming our systems were functioning properly. The first raindrops began hitting the windows as I worked, fat, heavy drops that quickly intensified into a steady downpour. From my elevated position, I had a clear view of much of the island's coastline. As I scanned the area, something caught my eye on the main beach to the southwest, a gathering of people. I grabbed a pair of binoculars from the equipment shelf and focused on the group. It was the Chagosians, at least 30 of them, standing in a large circle near the water's edge. Despite the rapidly intensifying rain and wind, they remained completely still, facing outward toward the ocean. None appeared to be taking shelter or securing boats. They were simply standing there as waves began crashing around their feet. I picked up the radio. "James, this is Martinez. You copy?" After a moment, his voice came through. "Martinez, I copy. What's up?" "I'm in the comm tower on monitoring duty. There's a large group of locals gathered on the southwest beach. At least 30 people standing in a circle at the water's edge. Probably securing their equipment before the storm hits," James replied. "Negative. They're just standing there. In formation. The storm's already hitting that beach hard, but they're not moving." There was a pause before James responded. "They know the island better than we do. Maybe it's some kind of traditional storm preparation. In the middle of a storm? With waves crashing around them?" I kept the binoculars trained on the group. "This isn't normal, James. Not after what we've seen." "Martinez." His voice took on a warning tone. "Remember our conversation earlier. Keep your head down. Just log it in your report and stick to your assignment." I knew what he meant. Anderson's warning was still fresh, but something about this felt connected to everything else we'd discovered. "Copy that," I replied reluctantly. "Martinez out." The rain intensified over the next hour, pounding against the tower windows like thousands of tiny fists. Wind speed readings climbed steadily. 40 mph, then 50, then 65. The tower itself began to creak and sway slightly with the stronger gusts. Through it all, I kept checking on the Chagosians through the binoculars. They hadn't moved. The waves were now crashing up to their knees, but the circle remained unbroken. Some appeared to be chanting or singing, their arms raised despite the punishing conditions. Their bodies should have been buffeted by the wind, yet they stood unnaturally still, as if anchored to the spot. I grabbed the radio again, this time contacting base security. "Security Command, this is Martinez in the comm tower. Be advised, we have civilians in a dangerous position on Southwest Beach. Request welfare check." "Copy that, Martinez. All patrols are currently securing critical infrastructure. We'll send someone when available." Frustrated, I continued monitoring. The base was transitioning to storm protocols. I could see personnel below rushing to secure loose equipment, close blast doors, and move to reinforced buildings. Emergency lighting had activated in several areas as the power fluctuated with the intensifying storm. The weather radar showed the storm had grown even larger and more intense. Wind speeds were now approaching hurricane force, far stronger than the forecast had predicted just hours earlier. I dutifully logged the changes and sent updates to command, but my attention kept returning to the beach. As the storm reached full strength, visibility deteriorated rapidly. The rain became a solid sheet of water against the windows, and even with the binoculars, I lost sight of the Chagosian circle. The last glimpse I'd had showed them still in formation, despite waves that must have been crashing up to their waists by then. I checked the storm data again. The barometric pressure had dropped faster than any natural system I'd ever seen or studied. The wind direction kept shifting erratically, another unusual characteristic. Everything about this storm felt wrong. Its sudden appearance, its rapid intensification, its erratic behavior. My radio crackled with various teams reporting secured areas and minor damage, but nothing about the Chagosians. I tried raising security again. "Security Command, this is Martinez. Any update on the civilians at Southwest Beach?" "Negative, Martinez. We've lost visual contact with that area. Too dangerous to send anyone until conditions improve." I logged this response in my report but added my own observation. Native group observed maintaining ritual formation despite dangerous storm conditions. Refused to seek shelter. Possible connection to unusual native behavior noted in previous reports. The tower shuddered as a particularly violent gust hit the structure. The lights flickered but held. Below, I could see vehicles had been moved into reinforced shelters, and most personnel had evacuated to secure buildings. The base looked almost abandoned now, battened down against the storm's fury. I continued monitoring radio frequencies, logging emergency reports, and coordinating responses where needed. But part of my mind remained fixed on the Chagosians and their strange behavior. What could possibly make them stand in the open during such dangerous conditions? What were they waiting for, or summoning? The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the tower. After what we'd found in the cave, the rituals, the sacrifices, this gathering felt ominous. And the timing of this unusually powerful storm immediately after our discovery couldn't be coincidence. As if confirming my fears, the equipment in front of me suddenly went haywire. The weather radar display flickered and distorted, showing impossible readings. Wind speeds jumped from 70 to over 100 mph in seconds. The barometric pressure plummeted to levels I'd never seen before. I immediately radioed command. "Base Command, this is Martinez. Weather instruments showing anomalous readings. Wind speeds exceeding 100 mph and increasing. Pressure dropping rapidly. Request confirmation from secondary systems." Colonel Anderson's voice came through, surprising me. "Martinez, this is Anderson. Confirm your readings. Our systems are showing similar anomalies. I read off the exact numbers, which continued to change as I watched. Sir, these readings aren't consistent with any tropical storm system I've ever seen. The intensification rate is... I trailed off as I looked out the window. Despite the rain and darkness, I could see something happening in the water beyond the southwest beach. The ocean seemed to be bulging, as if something massive was pushing up from below, creating a dome-like distortion in the surface. "Martinez, report!" Anderson barked through the radio. "Sir, there's something in the water off the southwest beach. I can't identify it, but it's large. Very large." There was a pause before Anderson responded. "Maintain your position and continue monitoring. Report any changes immediately." "Yes, sir." I turned back to the window, straining to see through the storm. The ocean disturbance was still there, now appearing to move slowly toward the island. The next hour passed in a blur of activity, logging reports of damage, coordinating emergency responses, and tracking the increasingly bizarre behavior of the storm. But through it all, I kept watching that strange disturbance in the water whenever visibility allowed. Something was happening out there, something connected to the Chagassians' ritual and the horrors we'd found in the cave. As midnight approached, the storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it had grown stronger, with sustained winds now exceeding 120 mph, according to our instruments. The tower swayed noticeably with each powerful gust, the structure groaning under the strain. I remained at my post, monitoring communications and tracking the storm's progress. But with each passing minute, the feeling grew stronger. This was no ordinary weather event. The natives knew something was coming. They had been preparing for it with their rituals, their sacrifices. And now, as the island shuddered under the storm's assault, I couldn't shake the terrible certainty that whatever they had been summoning had finally arrived. The tower's communication equipment suddenly crackled with static at exactly 11:30 p.m. I adjusted the dials, thinking it was just another weather-related interference pattern, when a voice broke through on a restricted channel. "Hello? Is anyone monitoring this frequency?" The voice spoke in accented English, the words barely audible through the static. "This is urgent. Please respond." I hesitated. This wasn't one of our regular channels, and protocol dictated I should report unauthorized transmissions immediately. But something in the desperate tone made me reach for the microphone. "This is U.S. military base Diego Garcia. Identify yourself and your purpose." I kept my voice official, professional. Thank God. The relief in the voice was palpable. "I am one of the original islanders. You must listen carefully. Everyone on the base must evacuate immediately." My hand froze on the dial. The Chagassians were technically not supposed to have access to military-grade communication equipment. "Sir, I need your name and location. This is a restricted channel. Names don't matter now." The transmission wavered, breaking up with bursts of static. What matters is what's coming. The displacement of my people has awakened something ancient and terrible beneath the ocean. A chill ran down my back that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I glanced out at the raging storm, remembering the circle of Chagassians standing impassively as waves crashed around them. "What do you mean? What's been awakened?" "The old ones from the deep." The static grew worse, words cutting in and out. "Sacred island for thousands of years. Rituals to keep them sleeping. When we were forced out, the balance was broken." I grabbed a notepad, scribbling his words as the transmission deteriorated. "I'm losing your signal. Can you clarify what's coming? What should we be looking for?" "Massive. Rising now. The sacrifices weren't enough to..." A burst of static obscured several seconds of transmission. "Tried to warn your people. Colonel knows but won't." More static. "Too late to stop it, but you can still save yourselves if you..." The transmission cut out completely. I tried multiple times to re-establish contact, switching through various frequencies and transmission modes, but the voice was gone. I immediately radioed James. "This is Martinez. I need you at the comm tower right away. Possible security situation." "Copy that. On my way." His voice was tight, professional. I spent the next few minutes rewinding and replaying the partial recording our systems automatically made of all transmissions. The quality was poor, distorted by static and the storm's interference, but the warning was unmistakable. The door to the communications room burst open as James arrived, his uniform soaked from the brief dash across the base. "What's the situation?" he asked, water dripping onto the floor. "I received a transmission on a restricted channel. Listen to this." I played the recording, watching his face as he heard the fragmented warning. James leaned closer to the speaker, his expression growing more serious with each word. When it finished, he straightened up. "Could be a hoax," he said, but his tone suggested he didn't believe that. "Doesn't feel like one," I replied. "Not after everything we've seen. The cave, the rituals, the Chagosians' behavior during the storm. Let me try to trace the source." James moved to the equipment, his fingers moving quickly across the controls. After several minutes of attempts, he shook his head. "Signal's completely gone. No way to pinpoint its origin." "What do you make of what he said? About the old ones from the deep?" James didn't answer immediately. He looked out the window at the storm that had been battering the island. "What the hell?" I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. The storm was changing. Not in the way storms normally evolve, but rapidly, unnaturally. The howling wind that had been rattling the tower's windows just minutes ago had dropped dramatically. The rain, which had been a solid sheet of water, had decreased to a light drizzle. "That's not possible," I said, moving to check the weather instruments. "Tropical storms don't just stop like that." The readings confirmed what our eyes were seeing. Wind speeds had dropped from over 120 mph to under 30 mph in the span of minutes. Barometric pressure was rising rapidly, stabilizing at normal levels. "This isn't right," James muttered, echoing my thoughts. "Nothing about this is right." I grabbed the binoculars and scanned the horizon, starting with the southwest beach where the Chagosians had been gathered. The circle was gone. No one stood on the beach now. I continued sweeping across the water, and that's when I saw it. About 2 miles offshore to the southeast, something was moving beneath the surface. Not a submarine or a ship, something far larger. It created a massive disturbance in the water, like an underwater mountain shifting position. Enormous waves radiated from the disturbance, heading toward the island with unnatural speed and formation. "James," my voice caught and I had to try again. "James, look at this." I handed him the binoculars and pointed. He took them, adjusted the focus, and went completely still. "What am I looking at?" he asked, his voice unnaturally calm. "I don't know, but it's huge, bigger than anything I've ever seen." The waves created by the object's movement crashed against the island's southeastern shore, much larger than normal ocean swells. Whatever was causing them had to be of immense size. "We need to alert command," James said, lowering the binoculars. "Now." I reached for the radio, but before I could call in, all the communication equipment in the tower simultaneously emitted a high-pitched squeal. The sound was painful, forcing us to cover our ears. Every screen flickered, displaying static before going completely dark. Then, just as suddenly, they came back online. "What just happened?" I asked, checking the systems. "Some kind of electromagnetic pulse," James replied, his eyes still fixed on the water. "But localized, targeted." I tried the radio again. "Base command, this is Martinez in the comm tower. We have an unidentified object in the water, southeast position, approximately 2 miles offshore. Large displacement waves approaching the island. Request immediate guidance. There was no response, just dead air. Base command, do you copy? I repeated, adjusting the frequency. After a moment, a voice broke through. Colonel Anderson's. Martinez, report status of the anomaly. Can you identify it? Negative, sir. Object is submerged. Size estimate. I looked at James, who shook his head slightly. Size estimate exceeds any known marine vessel or creature, sir. It's creating waves large enough to see from the tower. There was a pause before Anderson responded. Continue monitoring. Report any changes immediately. Sir, I added, I received a transmission from someone claiming to be one of the original islanders. They warned of something ancient rising from the ocean, said we needed to evacuate. The silence that followed was telling. Disregard unauthorized communications, Martinez. Focus on your duties. Anderson's voice had a sharp edge to it now. James, remain at the tower and assist with monitoring. I want updates every 5 minutes. Yes, sir, James replied, but the look he gave me after the transmission ended spoke volumes. He knew, I said quietly. He already knew something was coming. We don't know that for sure, James replied, but there was doubt in his voice. I turned back to the window, raising the binoculars again to track the disturbance in the water. The object appeared to be moving slowly but deliberately toward the island. The size of the displacement suggested something truly massive, far larger than any marine animal known to exist. The caller mentioned sacrifices, I said, my mind racing back to the mutilated bodies in the cave. They said the sacrifices weren't enough. James was silent for a long moment. Those rituals in the cave, they weren't just some cultural practice. They were trying to prevent something. Or summon it, I countered, remembering the circle of Chagosians standing in the storm. Either way, Anderson shut down our investigation immediately. Why? What does he know that we don't? A deep, resonant vibration suddenly passed through the tower, causing the equipment to rattle and the windows to hum. It wasn't like an earthquake, more like a massive pressure wave passing through the air and ground simultaneously. What was that? James asked, steadying himself against the console. I didn't answer. Through the binoculars, I could see the water bulging upward as if something enormous was rising toward the surface. The disturbance had moved closer to the island, maybe a mile offshore now, and was expanding. It's coming up, I said, my mouth dry. Whatever it is, it's rising to the surface. James took the binoculars from me and looked for himself. His normally composed face showed genuine fear. Get on the radio, he ordered. Tell Anderson we need to sound the general alarm. Now. I reached for the transmitter, but in that moment, every light on the base suddenly flickered and died, plunging the island into darkness. Emergency systems kicked in seconds later, bathing certain areas in red emergency lighting. In that brief moment of darkness, I looked out toward the ocean. What I saw there would stay with me forever. A massive shape had broken the surface, just part of it, but enough to know we were facing something beyond understanding, something that shouldn't exist in our world. In that moment of darkness, the ocean seemed to split open. What emerged defied all natural laws, a colossal mass that broke the surface like an island rising from the deep. But islands don't move with purpose. Islands don't have appendages. The emergency lights bathed the communication tower in a blood-red glow, illuminating James's face as he stared through the binoculars. He handed them back to me without a word, his hands trembling slightly. I raised them to my eyes again. The creature resembled a gigantic starfish, but twisted and wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. 5 massive, writhing limbs extended from a central body that had to be at least 200 feet across. Its surface wasn't smooth, but covered in thick, barnacle-like growths that caught the moonlight, making the whole thing glisten wetly as water cascaded off its bulk. My God, I whispered. Are those Eyes? Across the central mass, what looked like dozens of eyes of various sizes dotted the surface. They weren't arranged in any pattern that made sense, some clustered together, others isolated. As I watched, several blinked in unison, revealing black pupils that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light. James snapped out of his shocked trance and lunged for the emergency alert panel. His fingers flew across the controls as he activated the base-wide alarm system. Immediately, sirens began wailing across Diego Garcia, their urgent howl cutting through the night. "This is not a drill," James announced into the base-wide communication system. "Unknown hostile entity approaching from southeast quadrant. All personnel to battle stations. Repeat, this is not a drill." I kept the binoculars trained on the creature, tracking its movement. It was advancing toward the island with shocking speed for something so massive, pushing through the water like it weighed nothing. Each motion of its appendages generated waves that rose 20 feet high, racing toward the island's protective barriers, where they crashed with thunderous force. "It's moving fast," I reported, my mouth dry. "Maybe 30 knots. It'll reach the shore in minutes." Below us, the base erupted into activity. Red emergency lights switched on across the compound as personnel poured from buildings, rushing to predetermined defensive positions. Vehicle engines roared to life as transport trucks began evacuating non-essential staff to the island's interior. The radio crackled. "Communications tower. This is Colonel Anderson. Report status of the anomaly." James grabbed the radio. "Sir, entity is approximately 1.5 miles offshore and closing rapidly. Size estimate: at least 200 feet in central mass with 5 major appendages extending outward. It's unlike anything on record. Can you confirm it's hostile?" Anderson's voice remained eerily calm. I wanted to scream into the radio. What else could this thing be? But James maintained his professionalism. "Sir, its approach vector and speed suggest deliberate intent. It's coming straight for the base." A pause. "Understood. All available defensive systems are being brought online. Continue monitoring and report any changes in behavior." "Yes, sir," James replied, then switched channels. "Carlos, do you copy?" After a moment of static, Carlos's voice came through, tight with tension. "I copy. I'm at the motor pool. What the hell is that thing?" "We need confirmation of visual contact from other positions," James said. "Can you see it from your location?" "Affirmative. It's visible from here." Carlos's voice cracked slightly. "Everyone can see it. Jesus, it's massive." I swept the binoculars across the base perimeter. Personnel were manning defensive positions, heavy weapons being rolled into place. Some soldiers simply stood frozen, staring at the approaching monstrosity. "It's changing," I said suddenly, focusing back on the creature. "The arms, they're stretching." The appendages were extending toward the island, reaching out across the water like living tentacles. Each limb stretched impossibly, growing longer without becoming thinner. I tried to estimate their size, remembering the standard measurements we used for naval observations. "Each arm is at least 50 feet wide," I reported, "and they're extending hundreds of feet from the central body now." The creature's movement created a deep displacement wave that pushed ahead of it, heading toward the island's eastern shore. The barrier walls there were 15 feet high, designed to withstand tropical storms and tsunamis. But as the wave hit, water spilled over the top, flooding the coastal defense positions. A low, resonating sound suddenly filled the air, not quite a roar or a moan, but something more fundamental, like the groaning of the earth itself. The vibration passed through the tower, through my body. Every piece of equipment in the room began to rattle. Several screens flickered and died, and the radio emitted a burst of static. "What was that?" James asked, his composed facade cracking for the first time. "Some kind of sound it's making," I replied, trying to steady my hands as I kept the binoculars trained on the creature. "It's affecting our equipment." The creature was now less than a mile offshore. In the moonlight, I could see its massive form more clearly. The central body rose at least 30 feet above the water's surface, but I knew that was just the portion visible above the waves. The true bulk of the thing remained hidden in the depths. "The eyes," I said, my voice barely audible. "They're all looking at us, at the base." Dozens of dark pupils had oriented toward the island, fixing on the lights and structures of Diego Garcia. There was intelligence in those eyes, not animal awareness, but something older, something calculating. The radio crackled back to life. "All defensive positions. This is Colonel Anderson. Target the approaching entity. Weapons free. I repeat, weapons free." Machine gun fire erupted from multiple positions along the shore, tracer rounds streaking through the darkness toward the creature. The bullets seemed to vanish into its mass without effect. The creature didn't react, didn't slow its approach. "It's not working," I said, watching as more firepower was directed at the entity. "The bullets aren't doing anything." James grabbed his radio again. "Carlos, where are you now?" "North perimeter. Everyone's firing everything we've got at this thing. No visible damage." The creature was now a half-mile from shore, close enough that we no longer needed binoculars to see the details of its monstrous form. The barnacle-like growths covering its surface weren't barnacles at all, but structures that opened and closed like tiny mouths, thousands of them across its skin. "Sir," James said into the radio, addressing Anderson directly, "small arms fire is ineffective. Request permission to deploy heavy ordnance." "Already authorized," Anderson replied. "Missile launch in 30 seconds." I looked toward the east side of the base where our surface-to-surface missile systems were positioned. The launch platforms had been elevated, their deadly payloads aimed at the approaching nightmare. The creature's sound came again, louder this time, vibrating through my chest cavity. More equipment failed around us, radio channels dissolving into static, screens going black. "James," I said, pointing to the water, "look at its arms." The 5 massive appendages had spread out, forming a wide arc that would encompass the entire eastern shore of the island. Each limb now stretched at least 1,000 feet from the central mass, their tips hovering just above the water's surface as they approached the beach. "It's going to surround us," James said, his voice hollow with realization. The first missiles launched, their fiery exhaust trails cutting through the night as they arced toward the creature. For a brief moment, hope flared. These were weapons designed to destroy ships and bunkers. Surely they would have some effect. The missiles struck the central body in rapid succession. Explosions blossomed against the creature's mass, briefly illuminating its full horrific form in flashes of orange and white. The sound reached us seconds later, deep, thunderous booms that shook the tower. When the smoke cleared, the creature continued its advance, completely unchanged. No damage was visible where the missiles had hit, no indication that it had even felt the impacts. "Direct hits," James reported into the working radio channels. "No effect." "Repeat, no effect from missile strikes." Colonel Anderson's voice came through clearly, all pretense of calm now gone. "Deploy everything. All weapon systems. Maximum fire. Stop that thing before it reaches shore." More missiles launched. Artillery opened up from multiple positions. The night became a chaos of explosions and weapon fire, all focused on the approaching horror. The water around the creature boiled with impacts, and its body was repeatedly obscured by fire and smoke. None of it mattered. The entity advanced steadily, now only a quarter-mile from shore. Its forward appendages reached the beach first, massive limbs that dwarfed any living thing on Earth touching the sand with terrible gentleness. The weight of each limb crushed the barrier walls like they were made of paper, pushing through our first line of defense without slowing. "It's on the island," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "It's here." The reality of our situation crashed down on me with the weight of the ocean itself. Nothing we had could stop this thing. It was too big, too alien, too far beyond our understanding. As its limbs crawled forward onto Diego Garcia, crushing defensive positions and sending personnel fleeing in panic, I knew with terrible certainty that we were witnessing the beginning of the end. "We need to evacuate," James said, already reaching for the radio. "We need to get everyone off this island now." But as the creature's central mass approached the shore, rising higher from the water to reveal even more of its impossible bulk, I wondered if there was anywhere on Earth we could run that would be far enough. The missiles struck the creature's central mass in rapid succession, one after another, creating a hellish display of fire and smoke against the night sky. Each impact lit up the monster's wet, twisted form for a split second, a photographer's flash capturing the impossible in stutters of orange and white. The sound reached me moments later, deep explosive booms that rattled the tower windows and pressed against my chest. I held my breath, waiting for the smoke to clear, hoping, praying. But when the air settled, the creature continued its advance without hesitation. No chunks torn away, no black ichor spilling into the sea, no signs of pain or retreat. The missiles might as well have been pebbles thrown at a tank. "Direct hits confirmed," James said into the radio, his voice tight. "No effect. I repeat, no effect from missile strikes." A string of curses came through the radio. Colonel Anderson's voice, all military composure gone. "Deploy everything. All weapon systems, maximum fire. Stop that thing before it reaches shore." Below us, the base erupted into frantic action. More missile launchers raised their deadly payloads skyward. Artillery pieces swiveled toward the water. Every available weapon turned toward the approaching nightmare. A symphony of human defiance against something that shouldn't exist. "They're going to throw everything we have at it," I said, raising the binoculars again. The creature was less than a quarter mile from shore now, its massive limbs stretched ahead of its central body, reaching for the island like a starving man for food. Each limb moved with terrible purpose, not thrashing or waving, but extending deliberately toward specific points around our perimeter. I watched as more missiles streaked across the night sky, trails of fire ending in blooms of destruction against the creature's body. The ocean around it boiled with impacts as machine gun fire rained down from multiple positions. Mortars arced high and fell onto its massive form. Anti-aircraft guns, designed to tear apart enemy planes, directed their fury at the thing from the deep. None of it mattered. "It's not working," I said, lowering the binoculars. "Nothing's working." James grabbed the radio again. "Carlos, what's your position?" "South Barracks," Carlos replied, his voice barely audible through static. "We're evacuating personnel to the Central Command bunker. You should see this thing from ground level. It's like watching a mountain move." "Stay away from the eastern perimeter," James warned. "That's where it's making landfall." As he spoke, the first of the creature's appendages reached the shore. It touched the sand with an almost gentle motion, like a curious child poking at an anthill. Then it pressed down. The concrete barrier wall, 15 feet high and designed to withstand tsunamis, crumpled like paper. The dock facilities beyond it, steel and concrete structures that had weathered decades of storms, twisted and collapsed as the massive limb dragged itself onto land. The limb crushed a row of supply buildings as it pulled forward, flattening metal warehouses with the casual indifference of a person stepping on autumn leaves. Through the binoculars, I could make out tiny figures running between buildings, personnel fleeing for their lives as structures collapsed around them. I tracked one group of soldiers as they sprinted from a collapsing storage facility. They made it 20 yards before the limb shifted sideways, sweeping across the ground. They disappeared beneath it, gone in an instant. The radio crackled with desperate voices. "Eastern sector completely overrun. Request immediate air support. We need extraction at the motor pool. Building collapse imminent." A second appendage reached land on the southeastern point, crushing the fuel depot. A fireball erupted as storage tanks ruptured, briefly illuminating the base in harsh orange light. The creature showed no reaction to the flames licking at its limb. "Martinez!" James shouted, pulling me back to our immediate situation. "Focus. We need to coordinate whatever defense we have left." I tore my gaze from the destruction and turned to the communication equipment. Most screens showed only static now, but a few radar displays still functioned. The creature's central mass was approaching the shore, its bulk so enormous that it appeared as a solid wall advancing on our position. "Carlos," James called into the radio. "Status report on the motor pool?" "Gone," Carlos responded, his voice breaking. "The whole thing's gone. It just crushed everything. Vehicles, equipment, people, like they were toys." The third appendage made landfall to the north, destroying the aircraft hangars. I watched helicopters and transport planes, our primary means of evacuation, crumple under its weight. "Colonel Anderson," James radioed, "the creature has destroyed our air transport capabilities. Request alternate evacuation routes." "Understood," Anderson replied, his voice eerily calm again. "All personnel to fall back to Central Command. We're implementing full evacuation protocols via sea routes." As Anderson spoke, I noticed something through the window. The creature's remaining appendages weren't heading for shore yet. They were moving through the water, circling the island. "James," I said, pointing, "it's surrounding us." He looked where I was pointing, his face hardening as he realized what was happening. The creature wasn't just attacking, it was cutting off escape routes. "Colonel," James said urgently, "the entity is positioning its limbs around the entire island perimeter. I believe it's attempting to block all evacuation routes." There was no response, just static. A deep, resonating sound filled the air again, that same earth-groaning noise the creature had made earlier. The tower shook violently, equipment crashed to the floor, and several support beams made ominous cracking sounds. Through the window, I saw the creature's central mass pulling itself onto land. It rose from the water like a living mountain, blocking out the stars as it climbed onto Diego Garcia. Water cascaded from its bulk, flooding the eastern section of the base. The ground actually sank beneath its weight, the island's coral foundation cracking with sounds like gunshots. "My God," James whispered. "The whole island might break apart." The emergency lights flickered and died, plunging the tower into darkness. A moment later, red backup lights activated, bathing everything in a bloody glow. "We've lost main power," I reported, checking the systems. "Running on emergency generators now." James tried the radio again. "This is communications tower to any units. Report status." A handful of responses came through, each more desperate than the last. The infantry barracks had collapsed. The western dock was underwater. The command bunker was being evacuated as foundation cracks threatened its structural integrity. "This is Colonel Anderson," came a staticky transmission. "All personnel to evacuation point Charlie. Naval vessels are en route for extraction." I looked at the tactical display showing the island layout. Evacuation point Charlie was on the far western beach, theoretically the furthest point from where the creature had made landfall. "He doesn't understand," I said. "The creature has us surrounded. There's no way to reach the western beach." As if to confirm my words, the creature's fourth and fifth appendages emerged from the water on the western shore, crushing the evacuation point and the small pier extending from it. The radio immediately filled with panicked reports from the personnel stationed there. "It's cutting off all escape routes," James said, his professional demeanor finally cracking. "It knows exactly what it's doing." Another tremor shook the tower, stronger than before. Part of the ceiling collapsed in the corner of the room, smashing monitoring equipment. Outside, I could see buildings falling across the base as the ground continued to shake from the creature's movement. "Sir, evacuation point Charlie is gone," James reported. "The entity has completely surrounded the island. We are cut off from all escape routes." This time, there was no response at all. The radio channels filled with static as communication systems failed across the base. I turned to the window and watched as the creature's central mass settled fully onto the island. Its enormous weight caused visible distortion in the land itself. Diego Garcia was literally bending under it. Massive cracks spread outward from beneath it, splitting roads and toppling buildings. The eyes covering its surface, dozens of them, black and glistening, blinked in uneven patterns as they surveyed its new domain. "What is this thing?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. "Why is it here?" "I don't know," James replied, still frantically trying different radio frequencies. "But it came here deliberately. It knew exactly where to attack, how to cut off escape routes. This isn't some mindless creature, it's intelligent." Another violent tremor shook the tower. The structure swayed alarmingly, and I heard metal supports groan under stress they were never designed to withstand. "This tower isn't going to last much longer," I said, grabbing onto the console to stay upright. Through the window, I watched as one of the creature's massive limbs dragged itself toward the center of the base, crushing the command bunker. If Anderson had been inside, he was gone now. The thought should have filled me with horror, but I felt oddly numb. Death was everywhere now. What was one more life in this apocalypse? The emergency lights flickered and died as the generators finally failed. For a moment, we stood in complete darkness. Then moonlight filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the ruined communications room. "We need to get out of here," James said, his voice steady despite everything. "The tower's going to collapse." I looked out at what remained of Diego Garcia. Buildings lay in ruins. Fires burned across the base. The creature's appendages had encircled the entire island, creating a grotesque starfish shape with the central mass positioned roughly where the command center had been. There was nowhere to run. "Get out and go where?" I asked. "That thing has us trapped." One of the creature's limbs moved toward the communications tower, dragging itself across the ground with deliberate slowness. Each movement caused tremors that shook the remaining structure of the tower. "We need to record what's happening," I said suddenly, pulling out my phone. "Someone needs to know what this thing is, what it did here." James stared at me for a moment, then nodded. "Do it. I'll keep trying the radio." I activated the video function on my phone, aiming it out the window at the creature. Its massive central body dominated the view, a mountain of alien flesh covered in those bizarre eyes and mouth-like openings. Its limbs stretched across the entire base, systematically destroying anything that remained standing. "This is Specialist David Martinez, U.S. military base Diego Garcia," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "The date is March 15th. The time is approximately 0230 hours. What you're seeing is an unknown entity that emerged from the ocean approximately 1 hour ago. It has destroyed the entire base and killed." I paused, unable to even guess at the number. Many personnel. All weapons we deployed against it were ineffective. The tower shook again, more violently this time. A support beam crashed down behind us, narrowly missing James. "We need to move now," he shouted. I continued recording as we made our way toward the stairwell. "The entity appears highly intelligent, deliberately cutting off all escape routes before destroying the base systematically. A deafening crack interrupted me as the tower lurched sideways. The floor tilted beneath our feet, sending us both sliding toward the wall that was now becoming the floor. Equipment crashed around us, glass shattered, and the entire structure groaned as metal twisted beyond its limits. Through the collapsing window, I caught one final glimpse of the creature. One of its massive limbs had reached the base of the tower and was pressing against the foundation. Its many eyes blinked in sequence, watching as our refuge crumbled. "It knows we're here," I gasped. "It's targeting the tower specifically." The structure gave a final shudder before the floor dropped away beneath us. James and I fell through collapsing levels of the tower as concrete and steel disintegrated around us. My phone flew from my hand, lost among the debris. I caught a glimpse of the night sky through the falling ruins, stars wheeling above as the tower collapsed. Then something struck my head, and darkness took me. Pain brought me back to consciousness. Sharp, insistent throbbing at the back of my head. I opened my eyes to darkness and confusion, unable to remember where I was or what had happened. Something heavy pressed against my legs, pinning me in place. Dust filled my lungs, making me cough violently. Memory returned in fragments. The creature, the island, the communications tower collapsing. I tried to move and felt something shift above me. Concrete debris slid away, revealing a small pocket of space where I'd been partially protected by a fallen support beam that had created a triangular void in the rubble. Faint moonlight filtered through gaps in the wreckage. "James?" I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. The effort sent fresh pain shooting through my ribs. "James, can you hear me?" No response came from the darkness around me. I reached out with my free arm, feeling through the debris. My hand touched something soft, fabric. I pulled myself closer and found James lying motionless nearby, half buried under rubble. Blood darkened one side of his face. I pressed my fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse, finding a faint but steady beat. "James," I said again, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He was alive but unconscious. A low, resonant vibration passed through the ground beneath us. The creature was still moving. I listened carefully and heard the sounds of destruction continuing across the base, crumbling concrete, twisting metal, and that terrible organic noise the creature made as it pulled itself fully onto the island. I needed to see what was happening. Careful not to disturb the precarious balance of debris above me, I pushed aside smaller chunks of concrete and twisted metal until I created a small opening I could look through. What I saw stole my breath away. The creature's central mass now dominated the center of the base where the command building had once stood. It looked even larger now that it was fully on land, its wet surface catching moonlight in grotesque patterns. The thousands of mouth-like openings covering its skin opened and closed in rhythmic pulses. Its many eyes, black, glistening orbs of various sizes, scanned the devastation around it with cold intelligence. Its 5 massive limbs extended outward in a perfect star pattern, each one systematically crushing anything still standing. One appendage dragged itself through the residential area, flattening the barracks where dozens of soldiers had been sleeping. Another swept through the mess hall and administrative buildings, leaving nothing but rubble in its wake. Through a gap in the destruction, I spotted movement. Humans running, desperately seeking shelter or escape. A group of 5 or 6 soldiers sprinted toward the western perimeter, perhaps hoping to find boats or swim to safety. One of the creature's limbs changed direction with deliberate purpose, moving to intercept them. I closed my eyes before it reached them, unable to watch. When I opened them again, the soldiers were gone. This wasn't random destruction. The creature was hunting down survivors with calculated precision, using its limbs to methodically eliminate everyone on the base. It wasn't just destroying Diego Garcia. It was exterminating us. A fresh wave of pain washed over me, and I slumped back into my small pocket of safety among the ruins. Blood trickled down my temple. My legs remained pinned, and now that the initial shock had worn off, I could feel the damage. Something was definitely broken below my right knee. I tried to take stock of my situation. The communications tower had completely collapsed. We were trapped somewhere in the rubble, probably not far from ground level based on the amount of moonlight reaching us. James was unconscious but alive. The creature was still out there, destroying everything. My hand brushed against something in the debris, smooth plastic and glass. My phone. I'd lost it during the initial collapse, but by some miracle it had landed near me in the rubble. I grabbed it, hands trembling as I checked if it still worked. The screen lit up, cracked but functional. No signal, of course. Whatever electromagnetic interference the creature generated had knocked out all communications. But the device itself still worked. The camera still worked. I had to document this. Someone needed to know what happened here, what this thing was, what it had done. Even if we didn't survive, especially if we didn't survive, there had to be a record. I activated the video recording function, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The light from the screen illuminated my small space in the rubble with a harsh blue glow. "This is Specialist David Martinez," I began, voice raw from dust and fear. "U.S. military base Diego Garcia. I don't know the exact time. The communications tower has collapsed. The base has been destroyed by an entity that emerged from the ocean." I paused, trying to organize my thoughts. What would someone need to know if they found this recording? The entity appears to be approximately 200 feet across its central body with 5 appendages extending outward. It resembles a massive starfish in basic shape, but nothing about it is natural. It's covered in eyes and mouth-like structures. It displays clear intelligence and purpose. Another tremor shook the rubble around me. Dust and small pieces of concrete rained down from above. I continued speaking more quickly. All weapons we deployed against it were completely ineffective. Missiles, artillery, everything. It showed no damage whatsoever. It's methodically destroying the entire base and killing all personnel. This is not random destruction. It's hunting down survivors. I angled the phone to capture my face in the dim light. This began with strange sightings on the beach. I observed a figure moving with impossible speed several nights ago. Then we discovered a cave where the Chagassian locals had been conducting ritual sacrifices. I believe they knew about this creature. They were either trying to prevent its arrival through sacrifices or summon it. I don't know which. The ground shook again, more violently this time. I heard something heavy shift in the rubble nearby. Colonel Anderson knew something. He tried to cover up our discovery of the sacrificial cave. He wasn't surprised when the creature appeared. There's more going on here than a random attack. I thought about the transmission from the Chagassian on the restricted channel. Their warnings about ancient things awakening because the island's protectors had been forced out. The locals said something about the displacement of their people awakening something ancient beneath the ocean. They called them old ones from the deep. Whatever this creature is, it's been here before. The rituals were meant to keep it contained somehow. A massive impact nearby sent a shockwave through the rubble. One of the creature's limbs was getting closer. I spoke more urgently. "If anyone finds this recording, this thing needs to be stopped. Conventional weapons don't work against it. It's intelligent and deliberate in its actions. And I don't think Diego Garcia is its final destination. It's just the beginning." The rubble around me shifted as another impact struck somewhere close. My small protected space started to collapse inward. The beam above me groaned as the weight it supported increased. "It's coming. If you're watching this, warn everyone. These things are real, they're out there, and they're..." A deafening crash cut me off as something massive struck the remains of the tower directly. The support beam above me snapped with a sound like a gunshot. I barely had time to curl into a protective ball, clutching the phone to my chest, before the rubble crashed down. Concrete and steel buried me as my small pocket of safety disappeared. Pressure crushed the air from my lungs. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. In my last moments of consciousness, I felt the ground beneath me vibrate with a steady rhythm. The creature was moving closer, dragging one of its massive limbs directly over what remained of the communications tower. Its weight pressed down, compacting the rubble further, squeezing what little life remained out of anyone trapped beneath. Darkness closed in from the edges of my vision. My grip on the phone weakened as my strength failed. My last thought before consciousness slipped away wasn't of home or family or regret. It was simply wonder at what we had uncovered, what ancient horror we had awoken from the depths. Then there was nothing but darkness and silence as Diego Garcia, and everyone on it, disappeared beneath the mass of something that should never have existed in our world.